Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, sipping her tea as the soft overhead light cast long, uneven shadows across the linoleum floor. Nights like this were familiar companions to her. Silent, uneventful, thick with solitude. At 52, after decades of holding her household together and raising her daughter on her own, quiet had become both comfort and inheritance. Yet tonight, that same quiet carried a tremor beneath it, an unseen current that unsettled her, as though the wind itself was whispering change. The knock came suddenly, firm but not grim, cutting through the clamor of rain. Startled, she set down her cup and moved quickly to the door, wondering who would brave a night like this. The gust that met her when she opened it was fierce, almost pushing her back. Standing there drenched and blinking against the downpour was Daniel, her daughter Emily's boyfriend. His dark hair clung to his forehead, his jacket heavy with rain, and his face held that delicate balance between worry and apology. "Margaret," he called over the rain. "I'm sorry to drop in like this. I was driving home, but the storm turned nasty. Emily mentioned your power sometimes goes out when the weather's bad. I thought I'd check in on you." Margaret blinked, half in surprise, half in confusion. Daniel was always courteous when he came by with Emily, but never before had he shown up alone. She hadn't expected him to think of her tonight, certainly not to arrive at her doorstep soaked to the bone. Instinct overrode hesitation. She stepped aside and motioned him in. "You didn't have to trouble yourself," she said, as she shut the door against the moaning wind. Her voice was composed, but a trace of warmth stirred somewhere below the surface. "Still, thank you." Daniel offered her a small smile, one that softened his features. "I couldn't just drive past," he said. "I know Emily's away this weekend. I figured it's better not to let you sit through a storm alone." In the flickering kitchen light, Margaret studied him. He was young, too young, she thought wryly, to be worrying about her, yet there was nothing careless about his demeanor. It was an obligation that had brought him, but something genuine. He shrugged off his dripping jacket, hanging it neatly by the door. For a fleeting instant, she didn't see him as Emily's boyfriend, but simply as a man, someone who had thought of her when few others did. Then, without warning, the lights blinked once, twice, and died completely. Darkness folded over the house. Only lightning illuminated the outlines of their faces. Margaret sighed softly, already moving toward the drawer where she kept her candles, but Daniel's phone beam sliced neatly through the dark. "Got it," he said, following her steps. Together they struck matches, lighting one candle, then another, their amber circles pushing the shadows into corners. The house transformed, less lonely somehow, alive with the drumming rain and the muted hum of two voices sharing space. Daniel moved easily through the rooms, checking the doors, tugging at window locks, making sure nothing had come loose. The simple gesture filled her with a strange, unexpected comfort. When they returned to the living room, they each wrapped themselves in blankets, sitting across from one another as candlelight danced across the walls. Margaret wasn't used to company, not when Emily wasn't home. The air between them carried a note of awkwardness, but beneath it was something gentler, curiosity. "You must get storms like this often around here," Daniel said after a while. "More often than I'd prefer," she replied, smiling faintly. Her tone was calm, but inside her thoughts were restless. After so long alone, even an ordinary conversation felt extraordinary. They talked of small things first, the temperamental weather, the way the old house creaked in wind, stories of winters long past. Daniel recounted mishaps from his childhood, leaky tents, flooded trails, rain-soaked laughter around a campfire. Margaret found herself laughing quietly, realizing how long it had been since she'd allowed herself that sound. She noticed the cadence of his speech when he grew sincere, the steadiness in his eyes, the unhurried way he listened, and she reminded herself, firmly, that he was Emily's boyfriend, a young man whose life was still bright with possibility, while hers had settled firmly into habit. But still, something unbidden warmed inside her, more potent than the tea or the candlelight. Thunder rolled again, rattling the windows, but Margaret hardly flinched. What unsettled her now wasn't the storm beyond the walls. It was the disquieting calm that had crept into her chest. She hadn't sought company tonight, hadn't dared to want it. And yet, here it was, standing in her living room with rain-drenched hair and quiet eyes. As lightning flashed, she realized this night would linger in her memory. Not because of the tempest outside, but because of the visitor who had stepped, unexpected and utterly sincere, into her silent world, leaving her heart oddly unsteady. The storm intensified, battering the roof with furious insistence. Then, with a low crack from somewhere deep in the distance, the remaining hum of electricity died completely, plunging everything into thick silence except for the rain's relentless rhythm. Margaret reached automatically for the candles. But Daniel was already there, phone alight, steady as ever. His calm presence grounded her as they relit the flames, placing them carefully around the room until everything glowed with a soft, golden hush. The familiar space felt smaller, nearer, almost tender. Wrapped in her blanket, Margaret watched as Daniel moved about checking the back door, peering into the basement to be sure no water was slipping in. When he returned, hair damp, cheeks flushed from the cold, he dropped into the chair opposite her. "Everything's fine," he said. "Nothing's leaking." "You're safe. Thank you," she murmured. Her voice had grown soft, as though she feared the moment might break if she spoke too loudly. "I didn't realize how reassuring it feels to have someone else." "Check." Daniel nodded simply, understanding threaded through his expression. He didn't tease or brush it off. Instead, he let the pause settle naturally, a comfortable quiet filled only by thunder's distant echo. Their conversation picked up again, slowly at first, then easily, like a stream smoothing stones. Margaret told him about her small garden, the books stacked on her nightstand, the quiet rituals that shaped her days. Daniel listened without interruption, asking questions that showed genuine interest. When she spoke of her late evenings reading by the window, he smiled as if he could picture her there perfectly. In turn, he told her about his family, his love for hiking, his hopes to travel after graduation. His words brimmed with that exuberant confidence of youth, uncynical, bright, full of promise. Listening to him stirred something in her chest. A yearning she hadn't felt in many years, more ache than jealousy, closer to wonder. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Outside, the tempest softened to a steady drizzle, but neither seemed eager for the night to fade. The tea turned lukewarm in their cups. Conversation dwindled into the rhythmic tapping of rain, and then into quiet laughter, genuine, light, healing. Margaret caught herself studying him again. The flicker of candlelight in his eyes, the steady warmth of his voice, the unspoken respect in every gesture. He never crossed any line, never hinted at impropriety, yet his attentiveness carried a subtle weight that filled the room. When a sudden groan rose from the old house, she jumped. Daniel's grin broke through the dim light. "Don't worry," he said lightly, his tone reassuring. "Old houses like to talk during storms. It's harmless." She smiled, feeling that unfamiliar ease spread through her. His simple words, more than any promises, made her feel safe, seen. It occurred to her then how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her with that kind of effortless kindness. Not as Emily's mom, but as a person. That thought both warmed and unsettled her. Margaret shifted in her chair, reminding herself of the boundaries that should exist. Yet when Daniel leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head and laughing at something she said, she couldn't stop the smile that rose to her lips. It felt too easy, too natural. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them dared name. The candles flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, and Margaret suddenly felt the air grow heavier, as if the storm had moved indoors. She took a slow breath, willing her heart to calm, reminding herself of who he was and who she was still. She couldn't ignore the truth. It had been years since she felt this alive. Since someone had looked at her with such attention, the realization startled her, and she quickly busied herself with gathering the empty cups. Daniel rose to help, their hands brushing briefly as they both reached for the same mug. It was nothing, a small accident. but Margaret felt her chest tighten. She pulled back quickly, avoiding his eyes, while he paused as though searching for the right words. He said nothing, only gave a small nod and returned to his seat. But the silence that followed felt charged, as if both of them understood something had shifted, even if neither would admit it. As the night wore on, the storm outside weakened, but inside, Margaret's emotions only grew stronger. She hadn't expected company. She hadn't expected warmth. She hadn't expected to feel seen. Yet, here she was sitting across from her daughter's boyfriend, realizing that small moments, shared stories, soft laughter, a steady hand in the dark could stir feelings she thought she had buried long ago. And as the last candle burned low, Margaret understood one thing with certainty. This night was no longer about the storm outside. It was about the storm quietly rising within her. The storm outside finally began to weaken, the thunder more distant, the rain softer against the windows. But inside the house, the quiet grew heavier. Only one candle still burned on the coffee table, its glow barely lighting the room. Margaret Satan, the couch pulling the blanket closer, around her shoulders. She could feel her heartbeat quickening for no clear reason. Though she told herself it was just the long night, the storm, the strangeness of company she hadn't expected. Dodneil sat across from her, relaxed but alert, his eyes steady on her as though he was studying her face, noticing things no one else had cared to see. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but full, like something waiting to be spoken. Margaret reached for her teacup, but her hand trembled slightly. She hoped he wouldn't notice, but of course he did. "Are you cold?" Daniel asked softly, leaning forward, his voice low and gentle. "No," she answered quickly. Though the truth was more complicated, she wasn't cold at all. If anything, the air around her felt too warm, charged in a way she couldn't explain. Daniel didn't press, but after a moment he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The touch was brief, steady, nothing more than reassurance. Yet it sent a wave through her that she hadn't felt in years. His hand was warm, grounding, though he wanted to steady not just her shaking fingers, but something deeper. She froze, caught between instinct and longing before slowly pulling her hand back. She told herself it was right to keep distance, but the memory of that small touch lingered like a spark in her skin. Daniel watched her carefully, his expression thoughtful, respectful, yet carrying something unspoken. Then he spoke, his words deliberate as though he'd been holding them back all evening. "Margaret," he said, his voice quiet, but certain. "I know this might not be the right moment, but I can't keep it in. I admire you more than you know." She blinked, startled. Her lips parted, but no words came. She stared at him, waiting, almost afraid of what he would say next. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady on hers. "You've lived with so much responsibility, carrying everything alone. And yet you're still kind, still strong. I've noticed it from the first day I met you. You don't let people see how much you've done. But I see it, and it humbles me." Margaret's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She had spent years being invisible. Years where her efforts passed unnoticed. Years where silence filled the spaces where appreciation should have been. And now here was Daniel Young, thoughtful, someone who shouldn't be speaking these words to her. Yet he had said exactly what she had longed to hear. Her throat felt dry. She turned her gaze toward the candle instead of his eyes, afraid of the emotions welling inside her. "Daniel," she whispered, unsure what she was about to say. She couldn't allow herself to encourage something impossible, yet she couldn't deny how deeply his words struck her. "I don't mean to make this difficult," he said quickly, sensing her unease. "I just needed you to know. You're not invisible, Margaret. You're someone who deserves to be seen." Her breath caught sharp and unsteady. Noon had spoken to her like this since her late husband, and even then, not with such clarity. She felt seen and it scared her. It was too much, too close to the line she had promised herself never to cross. She rose from the couch, suddenly, gathering the empty cups, pretending she needed to tidy up. Anything to escape the weight of his gaze. But even as she moved to the kitchen, his words followed her, echoing in her heart. "You're not invisible." Margaret stood by the sink, staring at their trembling hands. She hated that she felt alive because of words she shouldn't have heard. She hated that she couldn't stop her heart from racing. She hated that part of her wanted to hear him say more. Behind her, she heard Daniel's footsteps. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, giving her space. His voice was calm when he spoke again. I know it's not my place, Margaret. I respect you, and I respect Emily, but I couldn't stay here tonight and pretend. I don't see who you really are." She closed her eyes, struggling to breathe steadily. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave, to never speak of this again. But when she turned to face him, the words stuck in her throat. Heist's expression wasn't reckless or selfish, was honest. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only sincerity. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Daniel," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't say things like that." "I know," he replied softly. But sometimes the truth is hard to hold back. Their ears met, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. The storm, the house, the years between them, everything faded. Except the weight of that moment, Margaret turned away again. Unable to let the silence grow into something more, she busied herself with the dishes. Even though there was nothing left to wash, she told herself it was foolish that the night would end and life would return to normal once the morning came. But deep down she knew nothing would ever feel quite the same. The storm outside faded into gentle rain. But inside Margaret's heart, a different storm had begun, quiet, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Daniel's words had broken through walls she thought would never fall, leaving her shaken and speechless. And as she blew out the last candle and the room slipped into shadow, she realized that the darkness around her was easier to face than the light Daniel had just placed in her heart. The first light of morning slipped through the curtains, pale and gentle after the long night. The storm had finally passed. The trees outside dripped quietly. The air smelled fresh, and the world seemed calmer, as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside Margaret's chest, nothing felt calm. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, Daniel's words echoed, "You're not invisible. You're someone worth seeing." She moved slowly through the kitchen, trying to collect herself. She wanted the morning to feel ordinary, to erase the strange intensity of the night before. But when she turned, she saw Daniel already there moving about her kitchen as if it were his own. He was making coffee, humming softly under his breath, completely at ease. The sight unsettled her, comforting on one level, complicated on another. "Morning," he said warmly, glancing over his shoulder. "I thought I'd get the coffee started for you." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quieter than usual. She sat at the table, watching him pour water into the machine, his movements steady, natural. It was such a small thing, but it made the house feel alive in a way it hadn't for years. When he placed a steaming mug in front of her, she wrapped her hands around it, needing the warmth. The silence stretched for a moment before Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time about last night. Margaret froze, her fingers tightening on the mug. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear what would follow, but Daniel continued, choosing each word carefully. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I know I crossed a line by saying what I said, but I can't take it back and I don't want to. You deserve to hear it." She looked at him, her throat tight. His eyes weren't reckless, and there was no hint of shimonly honesty. "Daniel," she began, struggling to find words. "You don't understand. Things like that can't be said. Not between us. It's not right." "I know," he said quietly, nodding. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. You've spent too long thinking you're unseen. That's not who you are. You're strong. You're kind, and you matter, Margaret. To more people than you realize." To me, her breath caught. She wanted to push the words away to protect herself from the emotions they stirred. But she couldn't. They had reached a place in her heart that had been silent for years. She had lived so long with responsibilities, with duty, with silence, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly noticed. For a moment, she thought she might cry, but she held it back, straightening her shoulders, keeping her voice steady. "You've said enough, Daniel. I'll remember your words, but that's all they can be." "Words?" He nodded, not arguing, not pushing. "That's enough," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know." The quiet between them lingered, heavy, but not bitter. Margaret sipped her coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. She knew life would return to normal soon, that Emily would come home, that Daniel would go back to being her daughter's boyfriend. But she also knew the truth. Something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. And then the sound of tires on the driveway cut through the silence. Margaret's head snapped up, She knew that sound. It was Emily's car. Panic rushed through her chest. The night they had shared, the words spoken, the unspoken feelings, they would all have to be buried now. Daniel heard it too. He set his mug down carefully, his face calm but serious. "She's here," he said simply. Margaret rose quickly, smoothing her sweater, forcing her expression into something ordinary. The door opened and Emily's cheerful voice filled the house. "Mom, I made it back before the roads flooded." "Did you survive the storm?" Margaret forced a smile, her heart racing. "Yes, I managed." Daniel was here helping out. Emily stepped into the kitchen, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Oh, you stayed. That's so sweet of you." She wrapped her arms around him easily without hesitation. Daniel hugged her back, his face carefully neutral. "I wanted to make sure she was safe," he said simply. Emily laughed, completely unaware of the weight in the room. She sat at the table, chattering about her trip, filling the silence with her bright energy. Margaret tried to listen, but her thoughts were far away. She stole a glance at Daniel. He met her eyes for only a second before looking away. The message clear, whatever had passed between them in the storm, would remain unspoken from this moment forward. Margaret sat quietly sipping her coffee, her face calm, her heart unsettled. She knew she could never tell Emily what had happened, never reveal the words that had shaken her so deeply. She also knew she would carry them with her long after Daniel left. For Emily, the morning was normal. For Daniel, it was a careful balance. But for Margaret, it was the beginning of something she couldn't name. She had been reminded of her worth, of the woman she still was beneath the years of silence. And though the world outside looked clean and calm after the storm, Margaret knew the real storm had taken place within her. Daniel's words had left a mark, one that would stay hidden, but never fade. Emily's laughter filled the kitchen. Margaret forced a smile and joined in. But deep inside, she carried the truth of that night. The touch of a hand, the flicker of a candle, and words that had left her speechless, words she would never forget.